There was a child in the 1970s who learned something nobody ever intended to teach. They learned that speaking up was dangerous, and silence was the only safe place. Nobody told them this directly. They simply figured it out through careful daily observation. And that lesson learned young and rehearsed daily never fully went away. We talk often about the resilience of children who grew up in the 70s, their toughness, their independence, their ability to handle adversity without complaint. But beneath all of that toughness was something quieter and far less celebrated. There was a fear operating beneath the surface of so many 70s childhoods, a fear of taking up too much space, of drawing attention at the wrong moment and paying an unpredictable price for doing so. This video will explore where that fear came from, how it shaped an entire generation's relationship with their own voice, and why so many people raised in that era still struggle to speak up clearly and freely today. Understanding this is not about blame. It is about seeing clearly, perhaps for the first time, the invisible architecture of a childhood that taught silence as survival before any conscious choice was ever made. The generation that grew up watching their parents navigate the cultural upheaval of the 60s and 70s inherited a specific uncertainty. The understanding that the adults in charge were figuring it out themselves, in real time, with no map. The common assumption is that 70s kids were taught to be respectful to speak when spoken to and defer to adults as good manners. That framing makes the silence sound chosen and wholesome. It rarely was. Respect and fear are not the same thing, though they wear identical faces. A child who is quiet because they feel safe is different from a child who is quiet because experience has taught them that noise invites consequences. The silence of a 70s child was not always the silence of contentment. It was often the silence of a small person who had learned, through careful observation, that the air in any room could turn without warning. Reframing that silence as good manners does a disservice to every child who lived inside it. It romanticizes what was frequently a survival mechanism and makes it harder for those grown children to understand themselves honestly. Picture a kitchen in 1974. A parent arriving home with a mood that filled the room the moment the door opened. The child at the table already reading it, the shoulders, the footsteps, the weight of the silence ahead. The child had learned long ago to read those signals precisely. A good mood meant you could risk a question. A bad mood meant you became invisible as quickly as possible. Eyes down, voice off, presence reduced to nothing. This was not dramatic. There were no raised voices in that moment. There was simply the accumulated knowledge of a child who had tested timing before and understood, at a physical level, what poor timing had historically cost. By the time that child was 12, the reading was automatic. They no longer decided to be quiet, they simply were. The assessment happened faster than thought, and silence arrived before any deliberate choice had a chance to form. Grown into an adult, that same person sits in a meeting with something important to say. The familiar calculation begins, and before the sentence is fully formed, something older than reason has already decided. Not now, not here. Stay quiet. What is remarkable is how ordinary all of this felt to the children living inside it. There was no single moment they could point to and say, "That is when I learned to become invisible." It simply accumulated without announcement. Developmental psychologists describe what these children experienced as chronic hypervigilance, a state in which the nervous system perpetually scans the environment for threat, rather than resting in a baseline of safety and predictability. Hypervigilance is not a personality trait. It is a trained neurological response, the brain's adaptation to an environment where emotional danger could arrive unpredictably, and where early detection significantly reduced the cost of being caught off guard. Dr. Bruce Perry's research on childhood stress responses shows that prolonged exposure to unpredictable environments reshapes the developing brain, heightening threat detection and reducing the capacity for spontaneous, unguarded self-expression over time. The 70s household produced this pattern with alarming consistency. High divorce rates, economic pressure, a cultural norm treating children's emotional needs as irrelevant to adult concerns, parents who were themselves frequently overwhelmed and unprocessed. What the children absorbed was not instruction, it was atmosphere. The lesson lived in 10,000 small moments of reading a room and making the internal calculation that speaking was a risk not currently worth the taking. The irony is that this vigilance made these children exceptionally perceptive and difficult to deceive. They developed a kind of social X-ray vision, seeing through what people said, to what they actually meant and felt underneath. What emerged from that fearful, careful observation was a set of social skills most of those children would not recognize as skills for decades. They became extraordinarily good at reading people before a single word was spoken. They could detect micro-shifts in tone that others missed entirely. They could anticipate emotional weather before it broke. They could de-escalate tension through stillness alone, a composure that communicated to dysregulated adults that everything remained under control. These were not small abilities. In professional and personal contexts alike, they amounted to emotional intelligence, so refined it bordered on intuition. The problem is that they were built not from curiosity, but from the necessity of managing danger. Skills built from fear carry a hidden cost. They work brilliantly in crisis. They create real difficulty in safety, because a nervous system trained under threat does not automatically know how to rest when threat is gone. 70s children became extraordinarily self-sufficient as a direct result of this conditioning. When you cannot rely on an adult to regulate the room, you learn to regulate yourself. When support is unpredictable, you stop building plans that depend on it. The competence was genuine and hard-won, but it sat alongside a real incapacity, the inability to ask for help without experiencing it as exposure, to express need without bracing for the dismissal that experience had consistently suggested would follow. Self-sufficiency here was not the freedom it appeared to be from outside. It was a cage decorated to look like independence. The door was always unlocked, but something very old stood firmly in front of it every time. What nobody told these children, and what many have never been told as adults, is that the self-reliance they built at such cost was a response to a failure of their environment, not evidence of any failure in themselves. One of the strangest legacies of the quiet 70s childhood is a capacity to endure discomfort that later generations find difficult to understand. These children sat with tension and unresolved situations for extended periods without requiring resolution or reassurance. They learned to wait not because waiting was comfortable, but because waiting was the only strategy available. You could not resolve the situation. You could only outlast the moment and hold yourself together until it passed. That endurance became a genuine professional strength, a tolerance for ambiguity, a steadiness under pressure, a refusal to catastrophize that colleagues found admirable. What colleagues could not see was everything that capacity had originally cost the child inside. Outside the house, something different was happening. Away from the charged atmosphere of adult moods, the 70s child could breathe. Outside was where risk was permitted, even welcomed, because outside had rules that made physical sense. You climbed the tree and either made it or you did not. You jumped the ditch and cleared it or fell in. These outcomes were logical, proportional, and unconnected to anyone's emotional state on any given afternoon. The physical world offered something the emotional world at home frequently denied: legibility. Actions had predictable consequences. Cause and effect operated cleanly, a clarity genuinely intoxicating to a child whose domestic landscape operated on invisible, unpredictable forces. This is why so many 70s-raised people described the outdoors as their real home, the place they felt most free. They were not escaping boredom. They were escaping atmospheres they could not control, predict, or adequately decode. There was also something else the outdoors provided permission to be loud, to be physical, to make noise without consequence. Inside the house, volume carried risk. Outside, it was simply what bodies did when finally free to move. The quiet that was forced upon these children in unsafe moments became, over time, a quiet. They chose a refuge, built deliberately inside themselves, and returned to whenever the external world became too demanding to navigate without prior preparation. Solitude, for the 70s child, was not loneliness. It was oxygen, the space in which they could finally stop monitoring the atmosphere, stop calibrating every expression, and simply exist without consequence for a few unguarded and genuinely restorative hours. That interior life produced people of unusual depth, capable of sitting with complexity without rushing to resolve it, comfortable in their own company, thinking in long, unhurried arcs that the modern world increasingly struggles to create the conditions for. The cost appeared in intimacy. When another person wanted access to that interior space, when closeness required undefended presence, the same door that had protected the child also kept every subsequent person firmly and frustratingly outside. Emotional self-regulation for the 70s child was never taught through attunement with a present caregiver. It was discovered alone in bedrooms and backyards, in the specific silence after a hard moment had passed and the coast was provisionally clear. They learned to manage emotional states rather than name them, to recognize fear not as something to express and have soothed, but as a signal to process privately and resolve before anyone noticed it had occurred at all. As adults, this produces people remarkably composed under pressure and remarkably unavailable in intimacy. Public emotion was never practiced in safety. Comfort was not reliably available. The absence of both left permanent architecture in how feelings get handled. What looks like emotional control from the outside is often containment, a holding pattern running since childhood, so continuous that the person inside it no longer notices the effort. It stopped feeling like discipline and started feeling like character. The adult who grew from this child is frequently mistaken for someone who does not feel very much. The truth is almost exactly opposite. They feel everything. They simply learned, before they had words for it, never to show it. Patience was not a virtue these children were taught. It was a survival requirement. You could not rush a parent's mood towards safety. You could not hurry a tense evening to its end. You simply waited, quietly contained. That enforced waiting shaped a deep internal relationship with time, a capacity to defer, to hold a goal across long stretches of uncertainty, without requiring constant reassurance that the effort was worthwhile or the direction still correct. In adult professional life, this translated into endurance that younger colleagues misread as passivity. It was not passivity. It was the practiced confidence of someone who learned early that the most dangerous thing possible was to rush a situation prematurely. Failure arrived without cushioning and without parental scaffolding around the disappointment. You failed. You felt it. You got up. There was no debrief, no reframe, no one helping you build a narrative that preserved your sense of being fundamentally worthwhile. What that produced was a durable resilience, not the resilience of someone told they are resilient, but of someone who simply continued in the absence of any viable alternative and discovered, through that continuation, that continuing was indeed possible. The adults these children became tend to underestimate their own capacity for recovery. They have recovered from so much, so quietly and consistently, that recovery no longer registers as achievement. It registers simply as the unremarkable continuation of a life. There is a particular quality to the resilience of 70s children that sets it apart. It is quiet. It expects no recognition. It does not announce itself as strength because it was never, even once, experienced as a deliberate choice. The social acuity from those hyper-vigilant childhoods produced adults of remarkable precision. They miss almost nothing: the shift in posture, the half-second delay before an answer, the word chosen instead of the one nearly spoken. In conflict they are unusually skilled, not because they enjoy it, but because they spent formative years studying it from inside, learning its textures and pressure points with the focus of someone for whom misreading it carried real costs. What they struggle with is the inverse, the easy, unguarded exchange of a genuinely safe relationship. When there is no threat to read and no atmosphere to manage, something else is required. A spontaneity never once practiced. This is the central paradox of the 70s raised adult. Extraordinary capability in reading and navigating other people, combined with profound difficulty in allowing other people to read and navigate them in return. One direction feels safe, the other does not. The hidden fear that taught 70s children to stay quiet did not retire when they left childhood. It moved with them into workplaces and relationships, still scanning, still calculating, still assessing the cost of speaking in any room. Understanding this matters now, in a culture that valorizes authentic self-expression and emotional transparency as markers of health. What looks like avoidance or emotional flatness in a 70s raised person is frequently the logical output of very early, very thorough training. The path forward is not to override the training, but to see it clearly enough to make genuine choices, to know, in any given moment, whether the silence is wisdom or old fear wearing wisdom's convincing disguise. So here is what all of that quiet was actually about. It was not respect, it was not good character or introversion, or the narrative adults reach for when they want a difficult childhood to sound like a gift. It was a child trying to be safe, trying to read an environment that made no consistent sense, trying to minimize a cost they could feel, but not name learning to make themselves small so nothing could find them. That child grew up. They became capable, perceptive, patient, and profoundly self-sufficient. They built real lives of genuine substance. But inside all they built, that original lesson is still quietly running, still counseling caution, still calculating risk. Knowing that is not a diagnosis. It is a beginning. You cannot choose differently from a pattern never clearly seen. Seeing it fully, honestly, without flinching is the first act of learning it is safe to speak.